Get ready before life happens. The podcast helping you navigate life's what ifs.
Welcome to Get Ready Before Life Happens. I'm your host, Tony Stewart. Today I'm joined by Ceres Chua, money psychologist and financial coach. Ceres, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tony, for having me. I'm so happy to be able to talk to your audience and discuss a little bit more about how money is impacted by our psychology.
Well, I'm really excited to have you because your newsletter has become one of my favorite newsletters.
Thank
So I
you.
want to give a shout out to Mind Over Money. So people are going to hear me through this episode giving shout outs. So, you can just go right now to the show notes and check it out and subscribe to Ceres' newsletter. But we'll go ahead and do the show anyway. So,
Thank you.
So to jump in, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your origin story and how did it lead to your interest in the intersection of psychology and money?
Yeah. If I have to really think back, my obsession with personal finance really started in graduate school. In graduate school, I made $14,000 a year, and I had to really stretch that really far. And I think the obsession with personal finance in general kind of started out of necessity. $14,000 back then, I went to grad school a long time ago, could probably buy a little bit more than what it can today, right? But it really is just enough to cover rent. I actually have two other roommates to kind of cut down the cost, to buy groceries, maybe like eat up with friends once a month. That's about it, right? And then, I think 6 months into graduate school, I met this guy, fell in love, and he lives the other side of the continent. Right. So then it becomes kind of a priority for me to say, hey, I should save a little bit more money so I can go travel to see him, or at least travel and meet somewhere in the middle. Right. So the obsession then became a little bit deeper, if you want to think of it that way, from hey, I need to stretch my money, to really figuring out how to crack the code on how to live well on very little, right? I say crack the code because it requires something more than just the day to day, right? And in this particular case, it sounds crazy. Living well just means being able to get on a plane to see my boat, like a $14,000 salary. Nothing fancy, but it was a stretch. It was still a stretch back then, and I was determined to make it work. And just through all that experience, I began to notice that managing money for myself is inherently psychological. So let me give you an example. I started recognizing that a lot of the marketing languages we see, are really designed to bypass our logical thinking, right? It's not to say, oh, you need this or you buy this, but a lot of language around marketing is they phrase it to create some urgency. Like, for example, if say, oh, there's only 3 left, or buy 2 get 1 free. A lot of times they create this urgency that shortcuts our circuit internally, that bypasses the logical decision-making process. And once I understood that, I found that I was able to talk myself out of buying a lot of things that I didn't need. So that realization really is the beginning of my fascination with the intersection of money and psychology. And I actually was so fascinated with it that I just, bring it up with conversations with a lot of my friends. A lot of it is, close friends. We'll talk about certain things. And let's say, when we talk about some sale that's happening, I would just casually mention, hey, did you ever think that, only 3 left? Is that really 3 left? Or is it something that they say to make us buy because, we feel like we don't want to miss out on it, right? So a lot of it is just, haha, yes, part of conversation or whatnot. It wasn't until one day that a friend, a really close friend of mine, just kind of said, hey, have you ever thought about sharing a lot of what you talk about with other people? I think it would be really helpful to help other people, because what you told me certainly helped me thinking about how I think about money and how I think about sales and all that stuff. And I would say that particular moment is when I decided that, hey, I have a passion. This passion can potentially help other people, and really turn this passion into my second career. So I guess a very long way to say here. That's why I'm here, talking to you about money and psychology, and then writing about it too. As you mentioned, my newsletter, and I'm also on LinkedIn, pretty active there, talking about this intersection of money and psychology and how we can, by understanding psychology, better manage our money.
Yeah, I completely agree that understanding psychology does help to manage our money. And, this is something that a lot of people in the financial
Yeah,
services community are just starting to talk about. But as you point out, like with marketing, marketing is designed for us to take certain actions. Like we think of it as a supermarket with the impulse buys of the
yeah,
things that are near the checkout counter. But as you point out, all these other things, 2-for-1 sales is a short circuit that whole concept of like, is this even something that I need?
yeah.
Because because instead of asking that question, you ask like, okay, do
Am I
I
going to
get
miss
the,
out?
yeah, exactly, rather than do I even need this in the
Yeah,
first place is like, wow, I want to get this deal. And understanding that, as you point out, stretches around to every part of our financial life.
it does. Yeah.
So, part of this is understanding our money mindset. Why
Mhm.
is understanding our money mindset key to a successful financial and life journey?
Um, I would say that if we understand our mindset, we then can start understanding how we think, right? So, and I kind of break it down into two categories. One is consciousness. Do we understand what we think on conscious level? And then there is the unconscious piece of it. So, conscious would be something like, as simple as deciding whether you want to buy something or not, right? So, I need orange juice, go and buy orange juice, for example. If it's, they say, oh, buy two, get one free orange juice. If you don't know that there is the unconscious part of it, which is a lot of psychological biases that's built in, like psychological biases would be something like a FOMO, like fear of missing out, like, oh my gosh, I don't need three oranges, or orange juice, but it's 2 for 1. So, or buy two, get one free. So maybe let's grab all three because it's cheaper that way, right? So there is the conscious part and then there's the unconscious part, which a lot of it is made up of psychological biases, as well as what I call the money scripts. Actually, I don't call that. A lot of people call that is the money scripts that we carry since we're little. A lot of that plays into how we think about money. So that's why it's really key to understand our money mindset in order to have like financial life that actually is meaningful in your journey. So let's actually go a little bit deeper. What I mean by that is, let's take anchoring bias, right? I think a lot of people have uh, uh, maybe cursory understanding of what anchoring bias is. Anchoring biases is nothing more than we unconsciously uh, make decisions based on the first number that we see. So, for example, let's say you are going to buy a piece of furniture. I had to do that, a couple years ago, and and then okay, so you walk into the store, right? And you see, oh wow, this piece of furniture that fits exactly where I want it to fit is on sale. It went for $800. Now it's on sale for $400. And you go, wow, 50% off. That's great, right? Let's say in another scenario, you walk into the store and you realize you just missed a sale. The price actually went from $200 to now back to the original $400. Okay. If you were to buy that piece of furniture on either scenario, you're paying $400, right? So there's no difference in the price you pay, but there's a difference in the way you think about how much you're paying, right? $800 to $400 sounds like a great deal, but from $200 to $400 in the other scenario sounds like a terrible deal. But equally, you're still paying $400, so it really shouldn't matter that you should, if you are actually logical, you just say, oh, $400, sure, I'll buy it because it fits the piece of, the furniture that I'll have in my place. But you're much more likely to buy it in the first scenario than the second scenario. And the reason for that is because your brain was primed initially in the first scenario, start with $800, so $400 is a bargain. In the second scenario, your brain is primed with $200, $400 is a terrible deal. And that is exactly how your mindset impacts how you make decisions. And if you, a lot of times this is unconscious. And I can tell you that even though I have looked into study and really try to absorb the whole anchoring bias thing, I am still very much impacted by anchoring. And it's only when I like consciously kind of overcome it and say, no, even though it feels like this is a terrible deal, it's still ultimately the same deal for me that I can like open my wallet and buy something, right? So a lot of these kinds of mindset are very at the subconscious or unconscious level. And when we don't examine these patterns, we really become vulnerable to the manipulation that's happening, right? So that's a classic case of marketing. And just about all kinds of marketing is built on some kind of unconscious biases that we have, the language they use around it. And if we're not aware of what's happening, we might end up overspending on things that we don't need. And that's not a good thing, right? And I would just say that money mindset, even though we talk about spending money, it actually goes way beyond spending money. It impacts our relationship too. So, for example, last year I was, doing coaching, and I've seen couples who struggle to manage a shared budget. So this is nothing about, it's not just about spending per se, but they're managing a budget in a household. And because one person has the money script that is more of a money worship, and these people tend to overspend. It's just the way that we think about money. And then the partner, is more of a money vigilant type. And these people tend to save every single penny. And when they don't understand how each other think, there's a lot of misunderstanding, there's a lot of argument about money and whatnot. So even beyond just spending, it affects our relationship as well. So having a good understanding of money mindset impacts ourselves and how we spend money, but it also impacts the other people around us that we may share money decisions with, right? So that's why it's so important to understand our money mindset if we really want to have better relationships with ourselves when it comes to money, and also have better relationships with other people when it comes to money. And I will just say this one last thing. I think a lot of people like to think that finance is just math and discipline. I wish it's like that. It would be so much easier. But it only works if we're a robot and we are unaffected by emotions and we're unaffected by outside influence. I mean, your listener listening, if they actually, kind of felt that pull of the 800 versus 200 anchoring example, then that's an example of how we are influenced without even knowing it. And if that's the case, if we're not influenced by that, sure, I think we can just do straight math and be disciplined about how we do it. But we're not. I have yet to meet somebody, a human being who is like that, right? So being human beings, being deeply emotional, and a lot of times easily shaped by the world around us, understanding our mindset and understanding our psychology is really a critical piece to building a successful financial life and a successful relationship as well. I mean, I think finance goes beyond just our personal finance, but how we deal with money with other people around us.
Yeah, well, you said so much there that's incredibly valuable. I mean, that I think as you talk about is, it does impact our relationship both with ourselves and with others. However, it's so easy, as you point out, to get sucked into a
Yeah,
decision about buying something because we're like, oh my, it's 50% off.
yeah,
And it's like, well, what is the true price? And, so the mathematical part is that you do your research before you go shopping.
yeah.
And you find out the ranges because car dealerships, everybody knows that
Yes,
car dealerships play those games. And it's like, ooh, we're going to throw in like, I don't know, underbody stuff for free.
yeah,
And, but it's like, well, wait a minute, it's you boosted the price by $2,000. So that,
yeah. You know who's notorious for that? Buying mattress. It's it,
oh,
like it's you can do all the research you want, but still never really come to like a consensus of like how much should mattress really cost. And it's so um non-transparent. It's so opaque that that particular example is actually really prime for being tricked by a lot of marketing messages to buy things more than what we really need. So yeah,
Well, and that gets to something too, is to be clear on what you're actually looking for when you're buying something. It's like they say, don't go grocery shopping when you're hungry.
yes,
You know, is like if you're desperate to buy a mattress and you go to one
yeah,
mattress store, then you're going to walk out probably with something that's not the best deal. But at the other
yeah,
time, I'd recommend to people to not stress too much about it because, like you said, it is so untransparent that if you spend $50 more than you might have,
yeah.
yeah, it's $50 more, but in the end, if it's going to stress you out negotiating,
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
not worth it either. And
Yeah,
I think that gets back to what you're talking about is understanding our personal money mindset and how we think about
yeah,
these things. Because for somebody else, spending $50 too much, it is a big deal. And that's also
yeah,
okay. It,
yep.
it's all your personal preference and it's your money.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But like I think the most important part is you don't want to feel like you bought something and feel cheated. Right? Right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's like it like goes back to that the the furniture piece, right? Like I bet you go home really happy spending $400 for furniture, knowing, thinking that it was $800, and now you paid $400 for it. Versus you probably go back feeling like you get cheated if you went back with a $400 furniture, knowing that it was just $200, 2 days ago, right? It's ultimately it's about, yes, spend money, spend it wisely, but also whether you feel good about the way you spend money as well, right? And hopefully by knowing that, oh, it's just a gimmicky thing, it's just, a marketing message to make me feel a certain way, then you say, oh, well, 400 is just $400, it's fine, then that's great. But a lot of times, we are heavily influenced and we didn't even know about it, the way we treat money and, the emotion aspect of spending money.
Yeah, so something that came to mind, and this wasn't something we discussed pre-show, so I'm not sure if you're comfortable talking about it, so I'll float it to you, is that one of the things that's starting to happen is that companies, because of technology, are creating very personalized pricing choices, uh, for people. So do you have any comments on that as how people can start to think about that, knowing that they're in a pricing bubble almost?
Um, I so I think the intention behind it matters a lot, right? And unfortunately, a lot of companies out there are making, they're trying to make more and more margin, right? That essentially means how a way they can get away with making you spend just a little bit more is what they want. And so they use a lot of these manipulative methods, what I actually call dark patterns, right? There could be ways to kind of trick you into buying more or whatnot. And one of the ways was they personalized to the point where, hey, if you, let's say, if you have a sick kid at home, and the only way to get the kid to sleep is to get some medicine from some, like a Walgreens or something down the street. And if the only way to get that is to call, use Uber Eats or whatever, to deliver it to you, and they charge you $40 for that medicine instead of going out there and get 10 for $10, right? When you're desperate, you tend to spend the money. And that, to me, that's bad. Like you are basically charging people so high of a premium to get the product they need because they really, really need it. Those kinds of personalized pricing is terrible, right? But then there's also the other side where, sometimes the personalization can get you to a point where it's like, oh, well, I need this and it's actually on sale. And I was just alerted it's on sale. And great, I will get it. That kind of personalization to me is a good thing because then you are not taking advantage of the fact that people need something at that moment and jack up the price.
That's interesting because, I tend to think of the negative side, but you're right, is it can have positive and negative, as with anything.
Hmm.
And one of the examples I'm thinking of is like they say is that like airplane pricing and hotel pricing can be based on your zip code. And
Yep.
that is just, to me, it doesn't seem fair because you think something should cost its
Yeah.
price, and it's
Yep.
not like that. But that's the way it's always been. People have always
Yeah.
tried to do that. So it's one of those things where you just have to, again, do your research, like you mentioned, is think about what you actually want to do and understand
Yeah.
your mindset. And to skip a beat. That's the other thing I recommend to everybody is to take a deep breath before you buy something.
Yes.
So,
Get that some of that blood to your brain so they can think a little bit better, right? So,
yeah, and people have heard me talk about this on the show, is not only is it used in marketing manipulation, but also scammers love to use
yes.
pressure. So
Yes.
anytime where you're under pressure is you're going to make worse decisions.
Yeah. And I always tell people, like before you do something, take a step back and say, am I emotional about it? Right? Am I angry? Am I happy? Am I, like if your decision making on spending money is driven by some kind of emotions, that probably means the message that you got trigger that emotions, and you have to start questioning, is that what I want? Am I being influenced unknowingly into buying something because I was triggered to feel a certain way through the marketing message, for example, or you know triggering like FOMO or something like that, right? So you kind of panic and say, oh my gosh, I need this, and if I don't buy it now, it's going to be all gone. So
Yeah, like the limited drops of certain things, or
exactly. Yep.
I
Yep.
have a young son. Well, he's not so young, but he's influenced by those things he sees
Oh yes.
online, like, like this is a limited run, or,
Hmm.
this is a special collab, and,
Yep.
it's only going to be repeated once. And it's like, oh my gosh. But, but it's easy to get, sucked up into that.
Totally. Totally. Yep.
So one of the things you talk about is moving from scarcity to abundance. And I think a lot of us do get stuck in scarcity mindsets. How do people start to move from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I talk a lot about this, but I actually use a different phrase. I actually prefer to use the word sufficiency instead of abundance. And the reason I do that is because to me, scarcity and abundance are actually implying some kind of quantity, right?
Mm,
Scarcity means there's not enough, abundance means there's a lot. They're both anchored in some kind of quantity. But sufficiency has nothing to do with quantity. Sufficiency is actually saying, I have enough, right? So by changing that language, I find that it's easier for me to process that. It's also when I share with other people, they feel like it's easy to process as well because now you're not tied to that particular number. You're not saying that this number is what I need to be sufficient, or to have abundance, right? Because I can guarantee you, people will always want more. You can have a number and you still want more, right? So that's really important because the scarcity mindset isn't really about how much you have. So by removing the language that is tying you to a quantity, you now have a more expansive way of looking at it. Scarcity mindset is actually a belief system, right? What I mean by that is somebody who has, maybe more than 99% of the people in this world, they can still feel like it's not enough, right? We can say the billionaires, right? They're constantly wanting more, right? How much more do you need? You have billions and billions of dollars, right? But to them, it's not a number. It's a belief system that they always want more, right? But then there are people like Mother Teresa, for example, or actually the monks that participated in the Walk for Peace recently, right? They have almost next to nothing to their name, but I can tell you they feel completely at peace with what they already have, right? So if you look at it this way, you see that scarcity isn't a quantity, it's a belief system. And scarcity and sufficiency really lives in a mind, not in the bank account. Okay, so going back to your question on how do you move away from scarcity mindset, I believe that at the root of scarcity mindset are a few myths. This is not actually not my this is not my theory at all. It's actually written by a book called, I think, by Lynn Twist. Yeah, I have it right next to me actually. um, so in her book, she talks about how there are three myths, and the three myths are: the first one is there's not enough. The belief that there's not enough. There's not enough money. There's not enough food. There's not opportunity for everybody. And then the second myth is more is better, right? The logical response to fear that there's not enough is that, well, yeah, let's have more. More is always better because there's not enough. If I don't have it, then you're gonna take it, and then I would never have it again, right? So more is better. It drives a culture of accumulation and greed. And then the third myth she mentioned is that this is just the way it is, right? More is always better. There's just never enough for anybody. And there's no way out of this, right? So the first two myths, there's not enough and more is better, they kind of feed on each other. But the third myth is what keeps us really trapped in that mindset. So how do you break free? The way we break free is we need to challenge each of the myth directly, right? So for example, if you want to counter there's not enough, we can remind ourselves of just, how adaptable we are, right? And like, for example, I talk about how when I was in graduate school, like stretch the dollar, right? If there's a will, there's a way. I stretched my dollar and I was able to accomplish mostly what my goals for, being able to spend and live well, quote unquote, well, on a $14,000 salary. So, there's a reason there is a saying that's, that says think outside the box. It really talks to the fact that we can have our imagination run free and help us stretch the resources that we already have, right? So if you think of it that way, then the first myth is not true, that there is not enough. There is, if you just know, kind of get creative about how you use what you already have, right? And then I also like to take that one step further, which is a lot of times I say, okay, so you reach this point, whether you believe it or not, you should just say it out loud. It says, what I have is sufficient to do X, Y, and Z. And the reason I like to say it out loud, and I encourage other people to say it out loud when my coaching, is that when we say it out loud, we retrain our brain to recognize what we're saying, which is we're saying basically sufficiency is right in front of you because I have enough to do X, Y, and Z. So it's, yeah, I have sufficient, right? So the more we practice this, the more we are able to break that belief that there's just not enough for everybody. And then to counter more is better, I like to tell people we need to learn to appreciate what we already have, right? If you truly pay attention to the value of what you already have, you naturally stop fixating on what you don't have, right? Your brain can't go both ways. You can't think of the value of what you already have and then still be thinking about what you don't have. Your brain doesn't work that way. So the minute you start paying more attention to the value of what you do have, you will see that more is not better. What I already have is better, right? So once you kind of start practicing that, you start getting to the point where you realize, oh yeah, what I already have is better. It's not so much I want more. What I already have is sufficient for me to do whatever I need. So once you break either of these first two myths, then you kind of already broken the third, because that's not the way it is. Your existing beliefs is not true. And you've proven to yourself that things don't have to stay the same way. And this is especially true if you already have a growth mindset, right? Growth mindset is all about you can do better if you practice and you get better at it and whatnot, that nothing is innate. So in that way, you kind of already know that change is always possible. And when somebody makes this shift, something really powerful happens. The fear kind of goes away. The greed also kind of melts away, right? And then in its place, you have this sense of calm, you have that sense of peace. And with that peace, it comes some clarity. And that clarity can lead you to make better decisions in your finance and your life, right? So that's how I think about moving from scarcity mindset beliefs to a sufficiency mindset and beliefs. And I'll just close with this because I share this a lot with people. They go, "Oh yeah, yeah." So it sounds so simple. How come people are still having this scarcity mindset? And it's true. It's a lot easier said than done. And I can tell you that I've been sort of practicing the sufficiency mindset for probably about 5 years now. And I still very much find myself thinking very small sometimes and thinking like, oh my God, I don't have enough, right? But it's practice makes perfect. I think I will always be on this journey of saying, okay, I'm done with scarcity mindset. I want to practice more sufficiency mindset. And I don't think I'll ever fully get there. So like kudos to like Mother Teresa, who was lived her entire life like that. I wish I could, but I think it will serve us much better if we try to think that way, because I do find that by practicing the sufficiency mindset, I do have a lot more peace. I'm not as scared of, do I have enough for retirement, or, is my emergency funds going to be enough to, to cover this kind of expense or that kind of expense. I no longer have that kind of mindset and thinking that causes a lot of stress. A lot of times it's I can see the bigger picture and practice that mindset and say, you know what I have is enough, and that's that brings me peace.
Well, and I think that's the most important thing is to find peace. And,
Yes.
when I think about some of the most happy people that I know is
Yeah.
they're the ones who they don't necessarily have the most money
Yeah.
or the
Yep.
richest lifestyle is.
Hmm.
And as you point out, there's billionaires that just are
Yeah.
completely miserable
Yeah.
and never have enough money. There's
Yep.
no amount of money that will fill the holes
Yep.
uh, in their souls or whatever it is. I don't want to say holes in the souls, but
You can't say that.
so, but it is true. And so I think that this is a great way to look at it is to flip that lens
Hmm.
to what is enough? Because when we're thinking about like our financial independence, retirement planning, it looks different for all of us.
Yeah.
And so when you're thinking about what's sufficient, then you're flipping that from what does everybody else think
Yes.
to what do I think?
Yeah. Exactly. Yep. And knowing that you have the resources to stretch a dollar if you really need to, right? So I think that it's also, for me, it's also very empowering in the sense of, I'm telling myself that, hey, doesn't matter what amount it is. I know I have the ability to stretch it if I really need to, cut down on the expenses if I need to 1 month, if if things are not going the way. So it's also very empowering, in my opinion, to actually develop that sufficiency mindset of saying, whatever it is, I know I can make it happen, or, stretch the dollar if I really need to.
Yeah, I love that. And this flips everything around because once you're empowered, you're going to make better choices and
Yes.
you're going to be much happier,
Yeah.
because money is just really a tool to live the
Hmm.
life you want to live anyway. So, Ceres, we could probably go on for hours. So it's time to get ready to close the show. I have what are called the Get Ready Hot Take Trio. These are three
Hmm.
quick questions that I ask all of my guests. The
Yep.
first one is, what's one money myth you're trying to break?
Uh, okay, so this goes back to what we just talked about, that there's a lot of myth that says, hey, if I just have more money, I'll be happier. It sounds very cliche at this point. I think we have all seen the research that shows that money does increase happiness, but only up to a point. Yet we kind of hold on to that and say, oh yeah, if only we have more money, I'll be better, right? And what I find for myself is, I'm human. I struggle with that a lot myself, and say, oh, if I only have more. What helps me actually is, instead of thinking of like, oh, I want more money, or like, oh yeah, if I only have more money, then I be better, is to say, okay, so if I have more money, what is the purpose that it's going to serve, right? So putting a purpose to your money. And so I call it more of a less of a knowledge problem and more of a purpose problem of this myth. So, like for example, when I talk to solopreneurs, a lot of times they set very aggressive goals, but then when I ask them, so what why? Why do you want to do that? A lot of people don't really have an answer. They say, oh, well, isn't that what I'm supposed to do? Right? I'm in business for myself to make more money. And what I find is people who seem genuinely happy and content and at peace with their work and their life, they talk a little bit differently. They actually give purpose to their money. Sometimes they can talk about, oh, I'm working towards my retirement, that picture that they have, and this is what will allow them to have retirement. So the money is going towards retirement, or the money is going towards the kids' education, or the money is going towards a cause that they care deeply about. So when we give our money a purpose, it becomes a lot easier to feel like you have enough. So I guess that's a very long way to say, yeah, I would love to break the myth that more money makes us happier. It actually doesn't. Purpose to our money is what makes us happy.
I love that. And I would agree is that more money, of course, I've dreamed about winning the lottery
Yes,
and
all
thought
of
about
us
it like,
do.
okay, well, what am I going to do with all that money?
Yeah,
And, after a few things, it's like, okay, I'd still have a lot of money left over with no plan for it. And it's
yeah,
like, how much do I really need to be
hmm,
happy? And that's the
yeah,
thing is, I have my wife, I have my son,
yeah,
we have a nice house, we have shelter, food, it's like, how much do you really need?
yeah, yeah. And I mean,
So
if you have purpose for all of it, and then you feel like, oh, well, it serves all the purpose, then that you have enough, right? So it's not about a number. It's all about, how can you use money to fulfill a particular goal that you have, either for yourself or for your family, for example.
exactly, exactly. I love that. So let's get out the time machine for a minute. If you could go back in time, knowing what you know now about money, what advice would you give your younger self?
Um, I think the advice I would give myself is simplify, simplify, simplify. Okay, so what I mean by that is don't spread your money across multiple accounts. Don't get really complicated with your investments. Automate as much as possible. I say that because when I was younger, I would job hop a lot. Living in Silicon Valley, that's actually pretty common of like, oh, you work 2, 3 years here and then you go to another company and gives you a higher title, more salaries or whatnot. So I job hop a lot when I was younger. I learned a lot. But what I end up happening is every job that I started, I opened a 401k. And then when I leave it, I just leave it there. So at one point, I have 5 or 6 401k kind of spread over several custodial accounts, and I had no idea how much money I actually have. It was actually kind of like it was just that stress on, like, oh my gosh, I have all this money over there and I don't know, like I forgot the login, I don't know how to log in. There's just a lot of stress around managing things that's kind of spread out. And what I wish I'd done, and this is the advice I would give myself about, back then starting a job is, if you have a 401k with a previous employer, just roll it over to your current 401k or even your IRA. Less is better. Simplify everything. Like you don't have to have everything everywhere. It's not, it adds stress more than anything else. So that will be the advice I would give myself. Simplify everything, even investment. For example, low cost index fund, boring as hell, but effective because you know exactly what you're getting. You don't have to worry about, making sure that you don't lose out when the money when the index not perform or whatnot. Just leave it there. Low cost index, that's what you should do. So that would be probably the two things that comes to mind when I was younger and working in corporate. Just getting too fancy, and fancy is not good when it comes to money.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful advice. Now, of course, we're not giving investment advice to anyone,
Correct.
but
That's right.
but
Yeah.
as you point out, is keeping your investment strategy simple. It's
Yes.
easier to execute, and the best thing you can do is to not touch your money.
Yes.
Um,
Yep.
it's hard, and even the best money managers in the world barely outperform the market 50% of the time.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
and those are
Yep.
people who are professionals. So, for everybody out there thinking about, trading and all those things is to think about people who have trained, their whole school career, their whole professional career. They have the
Yeah.
best tools. They still barely beat the markets. That
Yeah. If they can't do it, what makes you think we can, right? I mean, looking like that's the wisdom I have now. I'm like, duh, but back then I'm like, no, no, I know something that seemingly nobody else does, so I can outperform everybody. Yeah, no, it doesn't work that way. It did not work out that way.
Yeah, and that goes with the saying, there's no magic in the markets.
That's right.
And, so the last question series is, what is your number one tip to change the way we think about money?
Um, so I alluded to this earlier as well. I think our thinking around money starts with our beliefs. And if we want to change the way we think about money, we really need to reflect on our beliefs. I know, it's like it's a non-answer, but I think it was really true. So, for example, if you grew up thinking that money is bad, and I know there are people who like that, who, maybe the parents talk about, fight about money all the time, and they associate money with disharmony, right? Or chaos, for example, then you kind of develop this money script in your head and thinking like, gosh, money is bad. And let's say if you're a solopreneur, for example, when you think money is bad, it impacts the way you run your business. And one of the ways it impacts the way you run business is you tend to not charge people what you actually are worth, right? So it has material impact. Our beliefs translates to the way we behave and the way we think, and that with the way we think and the way we behave impacts the way money comes to us or money leaves us, saving and spending, right? So that yeah, let's say that's probably the best thing to do if you want to change the way you think about money. Change your belief about money first, and it's a long process. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, for me, I feel like I'm still in a lot of it, but it really is the best way to change the way we think about money once we update our beliefs.
Yeah, I love that. And I love what you just said there. Update our beliefs is,
Yeah, exactly.
our beliefs are beliefs and we believe them for a reason.
Yeah, yeah,
So, you do what you can. You can't do everything all at
yeah,
once.
exactly.
So, Sarah, where can people learn more about you and your work and subscribe to your newsletter, Mind Over Money?
Yeah, so Mind Over Money, you can find it at themoneymindsetlab.com. So the Money Mindset Lab. So again, talking about mindset around money, the moneymindsetlab.com. You can subscribe to my newsletter there. Or I'm actually very active on LinkedIn. So find me, first name, last name, you say LinkedIn dash and then the whatever the backslash or something like that. And then, my last name, first name and last name, Ceres Chua. So find me there, connect with me. I always love to hear from other people who either struggle with mindset around money, or right now I'm building a community for solopreneurs to think more holistic about money as as you go through your journey. I'm a solopreneur myself, so I'll share a lot of my journeys, a lot of my understanding. I do a lot of research around money mindset and all that stuff, and I share all my findings with the community as well. So yeah, so sign up for my newsletter, themoneymindsetlab.com. Find me on LinkedIn, and that's where I'm most active.
Fantastic. And for everybody watching and listening, as always, there will be links in the show notes to Sarah's website, newsletter, and LinkedIn profile. So if you have access to the show notes, you can go there for all the links. Sarah, thanks for joining us on Get Ready Before Life Happens.
Thank you. This has been so fun. I hope, I learned something about, how people think. I hope you learn something, as I hope your audience as well take something away from it. And, it's something I love to talk about. And I hope that, plant some seeds maybe for other people to think about money differently with, leading with a lot of the mindset.
Yeah, this is fantastic conversation, and you shared some great things. And as I mentioned, and again, I'll give a shout out to your newsletter for everybody watching and listening. Mind Over Money series explores some great topics, explains them very well. So I highly recommend checking it out. And as always, thank you for tuning into this episode of Get Ready Before Life Happens. If you learned something today to change the way you think about money, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and to share with a friend. You can also go to my website at tonystewart.com to subscribe to my newsletter and get access to a whole bunch of free resources. Until next time, let's change the way we think about money.